is some of the recording basics. Now, there's two rules of thumb when it comes to recording in long-form narration or in any recording. I'm a big proponent of punch and roll recording, so that's what I'm going to talk about most in this. But just so you know what the other two options are. There is clicker. Well, there is, I'm just going to make a mistake and then keep recording. So that's called an open roll, where I make no noise and I just kind of record. So what that looks like is if I'm recording, hey, I made a mistake. Oh, I don't care really. I'm just going to keep making a mistake. Hey, I made a mistake. And recording again and again. And then it's going to make it really hard for you to edit yourself. And most times when you're submitting this to an editor, they won't actually work with this kind of audio. So what you want to do instead is cut out the bad takes, or ideally use punch and roll. What some people do is the clicker method, which means they have either a little dog clicker or they just snap, and it makes that huge little spike there in the waveform that they can look for. So there's that, or you can clap and it makes that big noise too. So that is one way to do it. So if I'm going along and I go, hi, my name is Jennifer, and I like, hi, my name is Jennifer, and I like, so you can do that. I don't really, again, think that that is the best way to learn any DAW, so for our purposes, we're going to assume you're going to do it the right way. Okay. There's multiple ways to do this, but most people, once they get used to punch and roll, which is what I'm going to show you, prefer to do it that way, because they, once they get used to their DAW, can work it. Does everyone do it? No, but it is something to be aware of. Now, I digress. Let's look at how you punch and roll. So let's say I just made a mistake, but it is something to be aware of. Now, I digress. I had that little hesitation on I digress. So let's go ahead and punch in before that. So the way to do that is to put your cursor, and we'll zoom in for this so we can make sure that we're not cutting off anything from the previous, but we're also not on top of a breath. You'll see here is a breath. You'll get used to what a waveform looks like, but we're going to place it close to, but not cutting off that last syllable. If you want to, we'll talk about this now. If you want to see it a little bit more closely, hold down the Shift button and hit the up arrow, and then it'll zoom in. It's not going to make it louder. It's just going to make your visual display of your peaks larger. So now we can really see where the end of that previous word is, and also where the beginning of the next is. So that is where we want to start recording. But as you've noticed, when we start recording, it's just going to go right into it, and it's not going to give us time to get used to what we were saying. So the way to do that is to actually go to the options and then go down to metronome and pre-roll settings. And the reason it says metronome is because this is also very highly used for musicians. So a lot of these things are worked or talked about in music terms. But if you select that, we don't really care what's on the top of this screen. We only care down here in this very bottom box where it says pre-roll. You can have a pre-roll before playback, which is sometimes useful for editing purposes, so you can make sure you didn't cut anything off. But most of the time I leave that off, and I just turn it on pre-roll before recording. Now, pre-roll measures, says too. So measures is a music term again, and it's based on your beats per minute. So I will get into more depth of this in the later video discussion, but for now, we'll just pretend that we know exactly what this is and set this at a random arbitrary number. This is not going to be a second generally, because there's beats per minute, so 4 beats per measure rather, means that you're going to have to do some fancy math, and we're not going to do that right now. So we're just going to do it by ear. So let's set it for 4 and see what that sounds like. So now that I have my cursor set and a pre-roll turned on, let me go ahead and record. The cool thing is, by default, it records during the pre-roll, which is that time, whatever we told it. So if we come in a little too early, we can adjust. But for now, let's record, because once they get used to their DAW, can work it. Does everyone do it? No, but it is something to be aware of. Now, I digress. Let's talk about pre-roll. Pre-roll is an awesome thing. See how that works? I hear myself talk, and then I can come in right where I left off. So that might feel too long for you or too short, whatever it is. Some people like a longer setup because then they have time to, get going into their body, and make sure that they're matching the tone, etc. But you can just go back to options, metronome pre-roll settings, and down here in the pre-roll measures, adjust that accordingly. You can also put decimals. So if you want 3.5, 2.5, you can play with that. At a later time, we'll talk about if you want to maybe adjust your beats per minute. But for now, we're going to leave it at the default. I'm going to start recording, and we're going to look down here. Right now it says stopped. But if I hit the record button, you'll see it says record pre-roll. Now it's actually recording, and you see the waveform being created. Perfect. So when I'm going along and I make a mistake, I might go to wherever that mistake was. Perfect. So let's say perfect was where I made the mistake. Now, when we're looking at the waveform, you can make this bigger in most DAWs. In Reaper, it's shift up arrow. Then you can really see the waveform even more clearly. This doesn't impact the volume, just visually. So shift up and down arrow lets you do that. Or in Peaks display settings, if you don't like hotkeys, Peaks display mode, and then the Peaks display settings, it's this little slider here. Woo! So either way. So when we're visually looking at this, we can see a few things. First is that I usually have this set to a different hotkey for the scrolling, so I'm going to look like a silly person scrolling sometimes. That's fine. We'll see that this right here is a word and an end of a word, and this is a breath. Waveform being created. Perfect. So anytime I see this for me, and for most people, this would be a breath and this would be the end of a word. The best way to find a punch-in spot is at the end of a word, or the end of a sentence rather, before the actual breath happens, so that you're not in the middle of a breath. So if I was moving this over, it would be right in the middle right here, not lackadaisically in the middle of a breath, or else you'll have like a cut-off breath, which is what they're talking about, and not before the end of your previous word. So in Reaper, you can actually scrub this.
Perfect.
And you can kind of hear when that is at a 0, or you can't hear anything. So right there. So then when you hit the record button again, you see recording and you see the waveform being created. Perfect. Now I'll continue on. So what it's doing is it's letting me hear what I previously did, and then it's letting me pick up with that same intensity at the end of it. So that is why you would punch and roll. So that is why. So let's say I made a mistake here. I would then go back again to the spot, zoom in, same intensity at the end of it. So at the end of it. So I'll punch in here. Oops, and I'll hit the wrong hotkey. Intensity at the end of it. So that is why you punch and roll, so that you can, at the end of your recordings, have everything in just one long stream of consciousness that is exactly like the script says, without having to go through and cut out bad takes. Pre-roll. All right. So the other thing to note specifically for Reaper, intensity, because that technically works for every single one of our lovely things, is that if I jump a punch-in, for example, if I had, I'll just make an example by making the mistake. So we know that it's recording during pre-roll. That's why it says record, but it's in pre-roll. So let's put our cursor where we want it, hit our record button without having to go through and cut out bad takes. Now I'm going to start talking again, and it's going to be great. So I just cut myself off without bad takes. Talking again, and so I cut out. Now I'm going to. So if I hold down the Option or Alt key, you'll see that my arrows here have changed, my cursor. If I then click and drag with Option still held down, I can actually bring my clip from where it recorded during the pre-roll to the front of this. If you see this little notch right here, that means that it's repeating, or it's the end of the clip, basically. So you just kind of can drag it over until I kind of have it where I want, and then I can listen. Bad takes. Now I'm going to start talking again. Cut out bad takes. Now I'm going to start. Okay, great. So that is actually there. But if you notice, because it's cut off here at the end, you also just have to extend by clicking and dragging the end of this clip, because it was the clip wasn't long enough because it was assuming just on the time that you were actually in the record mode. So just to clean that up, you would just drag this little edge over to the side until you have it visible, and then you can just set your cursor again and keep recording. Start talking again, and it's going to be great. And here we are talking again. This is following the script. Perfect. So that is the general consensus of how to use Punch and Roll. So in a second, in this next section, I'll show you kind of a live version of it, so you can see it all the way in action. But that is the basics. Okay, so I'm just going to pull up A Christmas Carol because when I'm recording this, it's about Christmas time. So we're just going to grab this PDF and I will scroll through to kind of where it starts. And let's just see Punch and Roll in action. So depending on how you like this setup, you can either have them side by side. Some people, most of the time, are reading off of their iPad, so you could have your DAW full screen if you wanted. There's lots of different options to go with that. But for me, for right now, I'll just have them side by side so you can kind of see them both in action. And I'll hit the wrong hotkey again. Stave 1. Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. And Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery. Oops, that's the beginning. Scrolling. So then I would find right before I made the mistake. There we go. And then I would just zoom in a little bit. And I would put my cursor right here at the end of it. Dead about a doornail. So that's me breathing. So I'll put it right there before the breath starts, and then I'll hit it go again. And then I'll just look where I was, but dead about a doornail. So I should start right here. What there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary, And with this, if you make breaks in the sentence, you can, once you're practiced up, go from a comma, if it makes sense to do so. If it doesn't, if you can't find the flow, then feel free to grab it at the end of at the beginning of the whole sentence. So you'll just find where it was. His sole residual. Usually the previous breath of wherever you took it is the easiest place to find it, but sign. So I'll put it right there, click, and then I'll go. And then just so I'm being good, I will make sure that I am at the right place. So I should say his sole, assign his sole residuary legatee. Administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, solemnized, okay? Man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized. And then you can just go again. Man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. All right. So you can also, if you do that where you talk but you want to keep it, you can just scroll that last line back. So that's about 2 minutes worth, a minute and a half worth of me doing punch and roll. And it just takes practice. If you have been doing a different version of, recording, feel free to practice this with auditions, those type of things, something that won't stress you out. And then eventually you'll get good enough to put this into your full work. It will save you time. You can make the pre-roll as short as you need so it doesn't feel like you're waiting forever for the, punch and roll to be finished so you can just keep rolling. So play with it, find what works perfectly for you, and keep going with it. And I hope that helps.